She stood in the back of the room, quiet, unnoticed, just like always. No one remembered her name. Some didn't even know why she was there. When she spoke up once during a team meeting, someone chuckled and said, "Thanks, but this isn't your lane." That line stuck with her, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her exactly how people saw her. A nobody. Just another face in the background. But what no one realized was that she had been listening, learning, and planning in silence. Every slight, every dismissal, every closed door, it added fuel. And when the moment finally came, she didn't just walk through the door, she owned the stage. Now, that same woman, once told she didn't matter, gets paid $1 million just to speak. Not to pitch, not to sell, just to speak. Packed arenas wait in silence to hear her words. CEOs take notes. World leaders quote her. But how did she get there? What happened between the moment they brushed her off and the one where they couldn't afford to ignore her? This isn't just another rags to riches story. It's a blueprint. A journey of quiet resilience, sharp strategy, and a single decision that flipped everything upside down. The question is, what do they miss about her all along? And when did she stop playing by their rules? Because before she filled stadiums, she was just a girl with no audience, and a fire they never saw coming. She grew up in a small town where no one really talked about dreams. People worked hard, kept quiet, and didn't ask for more than what they had. Her parents were good people, honest, humble, but they didn't understand why their daughter always questioned everything. She wasn't loud, but her curiosity made people uncomfortable. In school, teachers said she was bright but unfocused. At jobs, managers called her hardworking but not leadership material. That word, asterisk, followed her everywhere, like a wall that kept moving no matter how far she climbed. After college, she landed a low-level role at a tech firm. Nothing fancy, just admin work. She showed up early, stayed late, and quietly studied how the company ran. No one noticed the questions she wrote down or the late nights she spent watching leadership talks on YouTube, analyzing how the top voices shaped opinions. She wasn't trying to copy them. She was trying to figure out what they weren't saying. One day, during a crisis meeting where no one had a solution, she offered a simple idea. Not flashy, just clear. They ignored it. Minutes later, a senior executive repeated the same idea, and the room nodded like it was genius. That moment hit her like a switch. It wasn't just that they didn't see her. It was that they chose not to. And that choice, it told her everything she needed to know about how the world worked, and how she'd need to move differently if she wanted to rise. She started writing late at night, pouring her thoughts into a blog no one read at first. It wasn't polished, and it didn't follow the usual business advice format. It was raw, personal, and painfully honest. She talked about what it felt like to be talked over in meetings, to be told she needed more experience, while watching less qualified people move ahead. Slowly, word started spreading. A few shares turned into hundreds. One of her posts, titled "The Invisible Woman in the Room" went viral. It hit a nerve. Women in leadership, interns, even quiet workers in small offices across the world started messaging her, thanking her for saying what they'd been too afraid to. At her job, though, things didn't go the way she expected. Instead of recognition, she was pulled into a meeting and told to be careful about what she posted online. The company didn't like the attention. They didn't like that she had a voice outside of their brand. That's when she realized her real power wasn't in the role they gave her. It was in the truth she'd started telling. Still, the pressure grew. Tension built between her growing online presence and her shrinking space at work. She felt stuck between playing it safe or risking everything. Meanwhile, a popular podcast host reached out for an interview. It was a small show, but it had real listeners. She hesitated. Saying yes could change everything, or end everything she'd worked for, and the clock was ticking. The night before the podcast interview, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at the ceiling. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from strangers, followers, even a few reporters asking for comments. But at work, the air had shifted. People whispered behind her back, and her manager stopped making eye contact. A memo had quietly circulated warning staff about unauthorized public statements. She wasn't named, but everyone knew who it was for. The risk was real. If she spoke openly, she could lose everything. Her job, her paycheck, the safety net she'd held onto for so long. But something deeper was stirring. That invisible line she'd walked her whole life, the one between being liked and being heard, was wearing thin. She wasn't angry. She was done pretending. Yet doubt crept in. What if they were right? What if she was just another voice online, easy to scroll past? The podcast wasn't huge, but it was real. And if she chose to speak, there was no going back. Her story wouldn't just belong to her anymore. It would belong to anyone listening, watching, judging. Meanwhile, the company began quietly assigning her work to others. Her email access started glitching. Her calendar suddenly looked empty. It was clear. They were phasing her out without saying a word. That quiet erasure hurt more than any open insult ever could. But she kept thinking, asterisk, maybe silence isn't safety. Maybe it's surrender, asterisk. And then, just before midnight, she opened her laptop and clicked confirm on the interview. The interview dropped 3 days later. It wasn't flashy, just her voice, and her truth. But it hit harder than anyone expected. Within hours, the clip started trending. Not just among working professionals, but across platforms, shared by influencers, reposted by career coaches, even picked up by a news outlet with the headline, asterisk, woman speaks out against workplace silencing, and people are listening. Asterisk, her words were everywhere, but so was the fallout. By the next morning, she received an official HR email. Breach of policy, violation of media protocols. They requested a meeting. No context, no room for negotiation. It felt like a trap. But that wasn't the twist. The real shock came when she received a message from a woman she didn't recognize. A former VP from the same company. Someone who had left quietly years ago. I heard your interview, it read. You're saying what we were all afraid to. They've done this before. You're not the first, but you might be the first to go public. Suddenly, it wasn't just her story. It was part of a pattern, a bigger system that had silenced more voices than she could count. The stakes were no longer about a job. They were about truth, and whether she was strong enough to carry it in public. As her inbox filled with anonymous tips and quiet thank yous, the meeting time with HR crept closer. What they didn't know was that she wasn't coming alone. She had something they didn't expect, evidence, and a voice no one could silence this time. She walked into the HR meeting calm, composed, and prepared. Her manager sat at the far end of the table, avoiding her eyes. 2 HR reps waited with printed documents and clipped voices. This is about your recent public statements, one of them began, carefully polite. She nodded, then reached into her bag and placed a folder on the table. Inside were screenshots, internal emails, and recorded meeting notes. Not just hers, but from others who had shared their stories privately. Dates, names, patterns, everything lined up. She didn't yell, didn't argue. She simply let the silence fill the room after she spoke. What they hadn't expected was what happened next. One of the HR reps, visibly uncomfortable, stood up and left the room without a word. A few minutes later, she received an alert on her phone, a statement from the podcast platform. The interview had crossed 1 million plays. That same hour, a well-known speaker agency reached out offering representation. They wanted her to headline a new series on workplace culture and leadership. The same company that once ignored her ideas now found itself facing public scrutiny. But just as things started shifting in her favor, another email hit her inbox. It was from the CEO, someone she'd never spoken to directly. Let's talk, it read. No apology, no explanation. Just that. She smiled, not out of pride, but because she finally understood. They didn't control the story anymore. She did, and this was just the beginning. She never replied to the CEO's email, not out of anger, but because she didn't need to. That part of her life, the silence, the shrinking, the pretending, was over. In the weeks that followed, her calendar filled up with speaking requests from companies, universities, and leadership panels. People wanted to hear her not because she had a fancy title, but because her story felt real. She spoke about workplace culture, gender bias, quiet power, and what it meant to speak up when your voice shakes. Each time, the rooms grew bigger, and the messages afterward more personal. The women who had messaged her in secret started to come forward too. Some wrote op-eds. Others started podcasts. A few even filed complaints with names attached. Her small act of courage had sparked something larger, a chain reaction of voices rising where there had only been silence before. She didn't need revenge. She had impact, and that was louder than any memo. The job she once held was filled quietly, but the company couldn't ignore the shift in public opinion. Their culture review went public 6 months later. Meanwhile, she signed with a speaker agency and began consulting for startups that wanted to build better, more inclusive spaces from the beginning. From nobody to keynote speaker, she didn't just prove them wrong, she proved herself right. Success didn't come from being allowed a seat at the table. It came from building her own table. And now when she speaks, she charges $1 million, not for the money, but because she finally knows what she's worth.